Welcome to Patent Behavior Bytes Coffee Break. I'm Erica Peruter, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Jared Campbell. In this bite, we'll be talking about integrating effective PBIS and mathematics practices. We often think about intervening with students with behavioral challenges in the classroom with just behavioral interventions. Yet we often don't think enough about the intricate relationship that exists between academics and behavior. In this behavior bite, we will talk about a few ways we can integrate effective behavioral management practices with effective instructional practices in the math classroom. So as we get started, let's talk about some of the most common behavioral challenges we might see in a typical math classroom. Jared, as a former math educator, what were some of the most common behaviors you observed in your classroom?
From my experience in the classroom and working with other teachers, I think the most common behavioral challenges fall into two buckets. First, there's the issue of students not being prepared for instruction after a transition. All too often, teachers have to wait for someone to move to a new space, get some materials off the shelf, get their book out, sharpen a pencil, or some other thing. It seems somewhat trivial, but it creates this pause in our ability to engage students, which can lead to other behavioral issues popping up if we wait. The second common area of concern is off-task behavior. These often are not major interruptions to class, but they do interrupt learning. And we often see these happen when instruction is not actively engaging for students, or when a specific task is too easy or too difficult for a student. Erica, how can a structure like school-wide PBIS help students engage in behaviors to maximize learning?
That's a great question, Jared. We often think about school-wide PBIS implemented at the school-wide level, but PBIS implemented at the classroom level is just as important. So it involves a few things, including operationally defining in positive terms what expected behaviors necessary for social and academic success look like, teaching those behaviors and reinforcing those behaviors. So we use data to help us determine how effective our efforts are. And we also use data to help us make adjustments, such as additional teaching, practice, or reinforcement. We should also have some pre-planned and evidence-based approaches for responding to problem behavior. Things like private redirection and restating what the expected behavior looks like. So in your examples that you mentioned, Jared, PBIS at the classroom level can really help by having those clearly positively stated expectations, explicitly showing what prepared looks like during math class. It's not enough just to have a poster in the classroom showing what those behaviors are, those expected behaviors are, as you can see the example here. But we also want to ensure that those behaviors are modeled, taught, practiced, and reinforced by the teacher as well as other adults, for example, paraprofessionals working in that classroom. We want to directly connect behavioral and academic expectations. So for example, we would describe what being prepared looks like. We want to directly teach that expectation in the context of all academic and even other classroom routines. So for example, if prepared means having a sharpened pencil, having their math book out on their desk, and getting manipulative, such as base 10 blocks or other things, other materials off the shelf, we would actually teach, practice, and reinforce those specific behaviors in the context of instruction. We would also want to tie our school-wide expectation, for example, of we are responsible to those behaviors. We want to provide reinforcement as well for when students engage in those behavioral expectations. So it might be something as simple as verbal praise when we notice students are engaging in the expected behaviors. You might also think about using your school's PBIS tickets, for example, if that's part of the reinforcement system. The other behavior you mentioned, off-task behavior, we would want to take a similar approach. We want to explicitly teach. I do, we do, you do, to help all students build understanding and skills of how to attend and actively engage within all types of instructional routines during the math class. These might be things like large group or whole group teacher-directed instruction, opportunities for partner work, independent work, how to do things such as use manipulatives like the base 10 blocks, and even how to engage in mathematical discourse and use mathematically accurate vocabulary with one another. So modeling, practicing, and reinforcing in the classroom during math will help students make those connections to real life expectations and behaviors. We can even seek some student voice to help define what those behaviors look like. Again, we'd want to reinforce student efforts at engaging in those behavioral expectations. I like to keep the 5-to-1 ratio in mind. And what that is simply we need to be telling our students what they're doing well or what they're doing correctly at least 5 times as often as we're providing redirection. But integrating effective behavioral practices within instruction is really preventive in nature. Incorporating proactive and positive behavior supports into academic programming, including things like pre-planned prompts and specific praise statements is just part of the way we do business, can help provide students with supports for attending, participating, and completing academic tasks. But sometimes, despite our best prevention efforts incorporating PBIS in the classroom, there are some times when we might see one or more students who are continuing to engage in problematic behaviors that aren't helpful to their learning or the learning of others. We might see continued off-task behavior, talking out, or even work refusal or not completing activities. These actually might be some signs that there is an instructional mismatch. So what this means is the work is either too easy or too difficult, and we might need to make some adjustments in our instructional approach. So Jared, as we think about that, what might be some ways that we can help make an accurate instructional match for students in mathematics?
That's such an important question, Erica. And I think that's the million-dollar question in education. The process used to make an instructional match can differ based on your role and function. And we have to recognize that first. As a parent, I keep an eye out for when my children need help acquiring a new skill or independent practice doing a skill that they already know how to do. Take shoes, for instance. My son's 2. He needs help putting his shoes on. My daughter is 5. She does not need help. She needs practice and feedback on whether or not they're tied correctly and on the right feet. In the core content setting, teachers can use direct observation to help determine which students need more help acquiring content and which students need more practice to build fluency. You can also embed other forms of formative assessment to help you make a good instructional match. And when you make a mismatch, you just need to make the correction. For example, if you think a student's ready to practice independently based on a 3-question quiz, but then you notice them struggling with a larger problem set, you simply pull them into a small group for some more modeling and guided practice to help them out. In an intervention setting, though, you're going to need a diagnostic assessment process to help you make that match. Formative assessment is no longer good enough. So you might give them a single skill probe and score it based on digits correct per minute to help you accurately identify that instructional match. And while there's room for error in the core content setting, that margin of error is significantly reduced in more intensive settings. So we need to rely on valid and reliable diagnostic assessment data.
That's such helpful information, Jared. Instructional matching is such an important concept that helps us integrate effective instruction with a learning environment that is engaging and helps students meet success. Sometimes students who experience academic difficulty in math might also display some really challenging behaviors that interfere with their learning or the learning of others. As we can see here on the screen, we want to be able to operationally define what the problematic behavior looks like. What does it look like? What does it sound like? We want to be able to gather data to help us determine what are the setting events or conditions under which this behavior seems to occur. And then we also want to be able to generate a hypothesis based on data about the possible function, the maintaining consequence or function of that behavior. For example, is the function in order to gain or avoid, escape or avoid things like attention, activities, or even tangible items. We also need to be able to determine, is the behavior related to a skill deficit? For example, does the student have the skills to perform the behavior or the academic task? Just as you talked about instructional matching a minute ago, that's an important component that goes into this process. So if the student is able to independently perform that skill under other conditions, then we need to ask, is the behavior a performance deficit? If it's a skill deficit in any way, then we need to teach and ensure an instructional match. As you mentioned, motivational interventions alone won't address skill deficits. If it's a performance deficit, then motivational interventions matched to function will be a good fit. Sometimes we need to take an approach with both. So as we think about, there might be some students who have the most significant difficulty in math, and how can educators best provide support?
Well, first, the margin of error is small for students that are experiencing significant difficulties with math. So the starting point has to be to gather accurate assessment data to help make a correct instructional match. Typically, interventions are meant to provide support with acquiring new skills or concepts, or building fluency with skills so they're able to apply them in other mathematical contexts. To help students acquire new math content, teachers should focus on principles of explicit instruction, explicit modeling, think alouds, manipulatives, visuals, immediate, specific, correct. If you're teaching word problems and self-regulation strategies or attack strategies combined with schema-based instruction have been shown to be really effective in the research. To help students become fluent, teachers need to increase the number of response opportunities that students have while delaying feedback. Time trials are a really good, effective research-based practice to build fluency. As have flashcard routines, right? Incremental rehearsal is a great fluency building intervention. To support motivation and reduce anxiety, sequential achievement, goal setting, and self-graphing can be used across the instructional levels. As students interact with their own data and see growth, it helps reinforce the idea of a growth mindset, or that with effort, we can learn new things. There are other evidence-based practices out there designed to help students learn new information or build fluency with that information, but these are a pretty good starting point for professional learning.
That's a really great information, Jared. And as we think about behaviors as well, following the instructional hierarchy, as students are new at learning a specific behavior, we want to use similar approaches. We can't expect them to perform it independently if they haven't had opportunities to practice. So this really is a great way to think about how to support students who have the most significant needs. We want to thank you for joining us today as we shared our tips for integrating effective PBIS and math practices in the math classroom. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. Our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And remember, this is just a bite of behavior. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.